Hello, and welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. All right, so I'm really very excited today because we have a very special show today. It's the first for the Psych and Business Podcast with two guests at the same time. Yep, that's right, you heard me, two guests at the same time. And we are breaking the mold today with the Stewart brothers. So we have Daniel Stewart and Dr. Peter Stewart from Stewart Leadership. Now, Daniel Stewart is the President of Stewart Leadership, which is a global leadership firm that provides teaming, organizational development consulting, coaching, and training services, just to name a few of their services. He's also, amongst other things, the co-author of the award-winning book, Lead Now. And we will definitely talk about that book. I want you guys to hear about this book. We are also very fortunate to have joining us today Dr. Peter Stewart, the managing partner at Stewart Leadership. Peter is an experienced business psychologist specializing in leadership consulting, coaching, and training. Peter, Daniel, welcome to the show.
Ernest, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much, Ernest. It's a joy to be here and to be able to have this conversation with you.
Thank you guys for coming on the show. I'm so glad that you two agreed to be my first double guests because I think you are awesome to break the mold. You know, two really great guys to talk about this. But before we get into the meat of things, I always want to start by asking about how you got into this work, because I know Stewart Leadership is a family business that started with your father in about the 80s. But I want to hear from each of you, your individual stories. How did you end up working for Stewart Leadership? Because you didn't just jump into it right away, right? You had some experience before, and I think you each had some very interesting experiences. So, Daniel, why don't we start with you? Why don't you start us off?
Yeah, sure. So, yes, how do I frame this up? So, yeah, we grew up with my dad doing this kind of work. So it definitely influenced us, but I will admit I did not intend to work with him. However, as I studied international relations and politics as an undergrad, I'm like, I don't want to work for the U.S. government and organizations and the power and control aspects of organizations and how people organize and team together really were very fascinating to me. So I got a master's degree in Colorado, University of Colorado, Boulder, and taught there team dynamics and leadership courses, and then went and worked for JetBlue Airways, actually. Did all of their leadership development work, change management, organization development for several years, then got into venture capital and did all of the org design and development work for all of the startup businesses that we had. And then ended up with Kohl's department stores, led their organization effectiveness group across the business, and then even had a stint in healthcare doing similar work. And so, over a 15-year period, you kind of look at different opportunities. All that while, though, Ernest, side conversations with my dad of, hey, what are you doing? And we actually wrote a book, The Lead Now, which you referenced, as a side project. And then it took off, and about 10, 12 years ago, left the corporate world and joined with my dad and then with Peter. So it's this, interesting paths that we all go through, and it's been a great journey. And now we are able to help tens of thousands of leaders all throughout the world doing lots of great leadership team development work.
Yeah, I love that story. I love the winding road, but still connected and still weaving in some great experiences that help you when you work with leaders. So I think that's such a fascinating story. And Peter, I know that you also started off doing clinical work, right? Because you're a psychologist by training as well.
Correct. Yeah, the where we end up and where you start, you never know what that journey is going to take.
Yeah.
And the winding road. So yeah, I started off, wasn't anticipating, like Daniel was saying, going into the family business, because my dad was just a solopreneur growing up. I mean, we were his staff growing up, in essence, working, getting the binders together for his seminars and stuff. But I've always been fascinated by people. What makes them tick? Why do they act the way they do? And so as I was in undergrad, started taking psychology classes, I fell in love with that. I'm like, oh, this is just awesome. Learning more.
Yeah.
So that's where I went in and got my master's and PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kansas, and ran a group practice after I was licensed for a number of years. But during that time, my dad would come, even back during grad school, because all of my research was in assessment development and standardization. He'd say, hey, we're wanting to tweak this part on our 360, or can you run the stats on this assessment? Or we're looking at building out a new part here. So I never really ever fully got away from it. Or we're writing a new book. Can you help edit this part? Or wanting to do this. And so he approached me. This is after I've had my practice for several years. And he said, hey, there's an opportunity for some coaching that I don't have capacity for. Would you be willing to coach some individuals on these assessments that you basically have written, reported? I'm like, okay, I'll do that. I was doing complicated psychological evals. I'm like, sure.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
360 assessment. So I started doing that and really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun to have this different outlet to look at. And just as I became deeper involved in the corporate coaching side, my passion for it just grew. So I ended up selling off my group practice and joining in with Stewart Leadership with my dad and brother to really help just extend the offerings, the solutions we're having to build greater leaders across the world.
That is such a fantastic story. And as you're talking, I'm listening to it and I'm saying, your dad is an expert at influencing, like influencing both of you. And he knew how to bring you both into the fold. And that's such a great example of leadership, right? How to influence the people that you work with and how to help them find their path. I think that's such a great skill. I want to know from the both of you, and Daniel, let's start with you this time. Why do you think this work is important? Why do you do this work? Why do you focus on leadership development?
Yeah, what's exciting is, even as a young guy helping out my dad, we would see the content, but we would also hear the stories of how it impacted people professionally and personally. So that when you talk to people and help them communicate effectively in the workplace, that can then help them communicate effectively at home. And to see
Yes.
that crossover. And so it isn't intellectually challenging, it's also from the heart. And that's frankly a very purpose-driven approach, and that drives me. And so to be able to not only work with my dad and my brother Peter, but then to work with so many great clients throughout the world, and to see an impact organizationally when we impact and work with their leadership capability, but we know that also has a broader influence around their families, their friends, their community. And that is a tremendous driver personally.
I love that. I think that's such a great recognition of the impact that you have holistically, right? And on the person and their environment. I love that example. Peter, what about you?
Yeah, it's similar. Recognizing that great leaders have a great impact on the world. And when we can make more better leaders, the world will be better. And you can call that idealistic, but we've been able to see that happen in so many different forms. And growing up hearing that with my dad, he made a speech they turned into a video, a training video back in the late 80s. And it was called Team of Champions, in which he went in and interviewed pockets of success in various companies. And I remember watching that and seeing the impact that leader had on those teams, and not just in the success they were having organizationally, but then in their personal lives as well. Because when employees are happy at work, it spills over into other aspects. And so it does. It pulls at the heartstrings a little bit, because ultimately we care about people. I went into clinical psychology because I wanted to help people. I'm continuing that journey of helping build leaders through the avenues and solutions that Stewart Leadership provides.
And I'm thinking about your experience, Peter, in the clinical world, because we were talking earlier a little bit about how you worked with children and how sometimes children aren't that different from leaders, right? So talk to us a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the impact of behavior and how that changes over time or not, to the point of how leaders behave and how that impacts the environment around them.
Ernest, there was a situation that comes to mind This was after I had just started coaching. I've been coaching for maybe a year and a half or so, and I had just flown back in town after doing some coaching with the CEO. And I'm back in my clinic, and I'm in a session with this 8-year-old. And I catch myself having the exact same conversation with this 8-year-old kid that I had been having with the CEO the prior day. And it was all around recognizing the impact we have on others, how we recognize our emotions, how we regulate them when we're displaying them to others. And it just was kind of this light bulb moment for me that you can strip away the titles. You can really strip away age in many ways. And fundamentally, as humans, we all have these needs. And we're continuing to try and understand these other humans that are around us. Some think and act a little more similarly to us, so it makes it a little easier to understand. Others act and think differently. So it takes some extra effort to understand that. And I think that is something that throughout our entire life, we're continuing to learn. How do we work better with people, with others?
Yeah, I love that you're keying in there on it's a continual learning process, right? Life and leadership, it's all a continuing learning process. And Daniel, I know you guys work internationally across many cultures and many countries. I'm always interested to know a little bit about how do you see leadership, either be the same or different across cultures, across countries, and how do you work with your team and leaders to help them improve their leadership in those, being mindful of those cultural differences?
Yeah, it's a good one. Two comments coming to my mind, especially building off of what Peter was just saying. That wherever you go, draw upon a psychological principle here, the valuation process, the feeling, the need to feel valued, that you are respected, that you're making a difference, is consistent no matter where you go. It may show up a little differently. Maybe how to access it or how to talk about it may be a little different. But fundamentally, every leader needs to feel and to then show to others a way to help them feel valued, that what they're able to do is making a difference and that their strengths, their ability to make that difference is real. So that's a powerful thing to be able to emphasize. So that's the commonality. The other aspect, a difference I would point out, is what we find in working across cultures is the ability to speak up and to share one's own thoughts, to utilize one's own voice. That can differ based upon the direction. In other words, speaking up in particular to one's superior. And in terms of a hierarchy, that can vary greatly depending upon the culture. Speaking down, so to speak, and I don't even like to say that, but you get what I'm saying, to your team, as you kind of think of a hierarchical sense, that is fairly consistent in terms of, yes, we have the ability, we feel comfortable, we can always improve, but to be able to manage up and to voice ideas or that might be different or not viewed as favorably, that is something we find is particularly challenging across different cultures. And, we can dive into the individualistic versus collective mentalities. Those are real aspects. And especially we do a lot of 360-degree assessments to be able to then allow the leader a full range of perspectives. There is sometimes a challenge to be able to have a 360 be fully transparent and candid with each other in various different cultures.
Do you have an example that illustrates that difference that you're pointing out? Because I think that's a really important distinction there, that being able to speak up, but culturally how that can be different.
Absolutely. I'll mention just one briefly. So we have great partners in China. We've been over there multiple times in training sessions to be able to then help build leaders. And what we find is we at first thought we could implement a 360-degree assessment into Lead Now program that which we would run over there. And it did not work at all. And instead, we replaced it with a self-assessment, and that worked successfully for the past 7 years. And so just even that insight, because the 360, people would get it back, or they would even have conversations around it. And people automatically would be like, oh, I can't say, I can't be candid. The self-assessment, they can be candid about themselves, and then they can anticipate what else they may need to gather feedback around. That was a much more successful approach. People increase their self-awareness.
Now, I'm a big data guy, so I'm a strong believer in taking the data and then using that and integrating it into the work that you do. So, Peter, I know that you do a lot of work with the assessments and have built a lot of the assessments. The example that Daniel gave, I'm thinking, so how do you get that external view, right? Because you can have your own self-assessment, but how do you get the perspectives of others, that reputation? How do you build that in the assessment?
How do you manage that reputation and build it in to take it? You're saying in particular in the international settings when you might not get that feedback, you're just saying generally.
Internationally, right? How do you do that internationally, especially when it's hard, when, as Daniel was saying, where some cultures don't promote that sort of openness?
There are still mechanisms for feedback to be delivered, to be able to, usually it's more formal. And so, you have that performance review, you'll be able to get that review. So it's leveraging that opportunity to do it. But just to pull on a thread that Daniel was talking about in China, as we've learned the principles from our Lead Now leadership development model, there are 21 dimensions of leadership, that those principles are universal. But the individual application of them, the behaviors that may be demonstrated under those principles, that's where you get some of those cultural variations. And just to highlight one, for example, one of the principles is on personal development and learning. And one thing we observed from our work in China and the cohorts running through there was a desire for them to retake courses that they have already taken. This idea that, and I'd say many times in America, you go to a 2 or a 3 day course and you get the certification, I did the course.
Yeah, and you're done.
And you're done. You wouldn't necessarily go back and redo it. Whereas there's this eagerness for learning in the Chinese cohorts that we've partnered with, where they want to come back and do it again, because they realize the next time I go through, I'm going to get something different out of it. I'm going to learn something different. I want to master this concept and to learn it. So that's another way in which you can really leverage, okay, well, maybe they can't get that direct feedback or give that to their boss, but yet we're able to now play off of that strength they have of this desire to learn, to just enforce those principles over and over again.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. The recognition there of mastering it requires that repetition, right? I think that's such a novel concept. You're right. When I go to a training and I get my certification, I consider myself an expert, and that's it. I'm done. I never think, okay, let me go back through that course and through that material again to understand it. I think one of the things that I appreciate about you guys and the work that you do is the simplicity of your approach. And I'm talking about the book Lead Now, because I've read that book and I really appreciate how practical it is and how easy it is to apply it in your everyday setting. So can you guys talk a little bit about the thought around the book and how it's meant to help leaders grow and develop?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I will often describe the book as, we wrote the book not meant to be read, but to be used. And it's one of those distinctions that's important, because sometimes you get a book and you're like, I don't know if I have time to dive into the whole thing. No, the idea is actually to access the book by virtue of deciding what of the 21 leadership dimensions you want to work on. Pick one. It might be change management. It might be effectively communicating better. It might be delegating better. It might be coaching. Okay, there's one chapter for each of those topics. Go to that chapter, look at a few tips, ideas, suggestions, write down some notes, identify what you want to do this week, and then I often will say, shut the book and go do it. I mean, you can always go back and get more ideas and use this, but it's really at the core a personal coaching guide so that busy leaders are able to still focus on their development, because we believe strongly that leadership skills is a unique set of skills, just like marketing skills or engineering skills or accounting skills. And yet we don't always think of it like that or pay attention to it like that. And we need to be able to, those of us in manager roles, leadership roles, or aspiring to be in those roles, we need to then have practical tools in the moment to challenge ourselves to be able to continue to develop on those leadership skills. So yes, it's opening it up, pick something, shut the book, and go act on it.
Yeah, so that learn, do, practice cycle. Yeah, I love that. What about you, Peter? What do you think is really helpful from that book?
Yeah, and I think it's as you're highlighting, it's the practicality of it. You don't have, as a busy professional, time set aside. My Thursday, I'm just going to work on developing my leadership abilities. Like, no, it's inundated with the tyranny of the urgent, with the fires that are coming up all the time. And so this development of oneself in terms of skills gets pushed to the side so readily and so easily, and understandably so. And so as we recognize that's the condition of the modern day professional, and it has been for many years, how do we help them develop in this fast-paced, urgent environment? And it's identifying little steps, little, tips, little behaviors. There's an analogy we start off the Lead Now book with that talks of a story, goes back 1849. This is the gold rush time. And we have this merchant out in Boston, and he's not satisfied with his store and how well he's doing. He has visions of gold. So he moves out west, sells all his stuff, gets his gear and stakes his claim, and he starts panning for gold out in California. So day in, day out, he's down in that river, and he's not finding a lot of gold. One day, this old prospector moseys on over the hill and asks him how he's doing. And frustrated, says, "I'm not finding any rocks in this river," as he points over just this big pile he's accumulated off on the bank. And so the prospector kind of shakes his head and he walks over to that pile of rocks. He says, "You've got gold here, son." And he picks two up and smashes them together, and see these flecks of gold in the rock? And the merchant says, No. I don't want those little bits of gold. I want the big old nuggets. Like what you've got hanging off that leather pouch on your belt. Now the prospector, he throws the rocks and he says, "Well, I don't know about you, but these little flecks of gold have brought me tremendous wealth." As he pours the contents of that pouch in his hand, and it's just a pile of flecks of gold. It's just recognizing we're usually looking for that big old nugget, that one thing that's going to change everything. And what we believe is that our leadership development, our skills, they're not built one massive step at a time, big jump. It's the little, slow, steady, and intentional accumulation of those flecks of gold over time. That's really how true leadership skills are built.
Yeah, I remember that story from the book, and one of the things that you've said is this intentional, right? I think it's really important that the leadership development be intentional. I've worked with numerous organizations where they would like to make it important. They kind of understand it's important, but they don't intentionally make it important.
So I'll just mention the idea that it kind of reminds me of something I learned years ago about culture, that every organization has a culture. It's just a matter of if it's a culture that's going to be helpful or not, because it's going to emerge.
Yeah.
And it's a similar practice as you think about it with leaders. You're going to have a certain leadership style that emerges. And it's a question of, are you going to just let that happen? A kind of like a passive thing, or just emergent? Or are you going to be disciplined and intentional and focused and wanting to match the leadership style with what's needed for the strategy of the business? Now, that's a different mindset. And that also takes focus and effort and coordination and skill development. Yes, 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 yes. Versus just letting things happen, as well as letting the dysfunctions just continuing to grow. And so it takes a timeout, it takes a concerted effort. And what we find is organizations that are growth focused and view the people side of things as an important part of that growth. That is where the magic often can happen. When organizations are wanting to grow and they do not see the people side, the leader side, the engagement side, the participation, the empowerment side as very important, and they view it more as transactional, that is often a recipe for maybe short-term gains, but not necessarily longer-term growth. And so there we find the need to focus and connect growth with the people side, being intentional about the leadership, the management, and developing of the culture as well.
And if anything that we've learned from COVID, it's recognizing that the voice of the people matter. This is the decade of the employee. It has been, and COVID taught us that and is continuing to be so. And with the gig economy continuing, the growth of organizations wanting to have the battle and the fight for the top talent, how do you make your organization become that destination employer? That employer wants to be developed, or the employee wants to be developed. They want opportunities for growth. They want to expand and enhance their skills, not just technically speaking, but they want to be able to become better people leaders. And organizations that recognize the distinction between technical talent and people leaders and how they need to be developing both, those are the organizations that are going to thrive. And they're going to win the talent.
I think the recognition, I always say that people are the most important resource of any organization. Without your people, good people, you can't get anything done. You can have technology process. Without the people, you're not going anywhere, right? And so recognizing that that is the most important resource in your organization and treating it appropriately. I was at a meeting recently, and one of my clients said, we recognize that our people are our most important resource. And we recognize that time is the most important resource for our people. So we're always thinking, how can we help our people be more efficient with their time? What can we do as an organization to help them take best advantage of that resource? Daniel, I know you have a background and have done a lot of work in change. And nowadays, there's just so much change going on. It's unavoidable. What are you seeing, or what are you doing to help leaders better prepare to be flexible and adaptable in this changing environment that we're all kind of just stuck in right now?
Yeah, it's a good point. So the first thing, and it's a tricky one to embrace, but it's the initial mindset that we're not waiting for things to calm down. We're not waiting for this return. We're not waiting for this plateau. We're not waiting for things to be over. No. And it's making sure that instead we reframe that mindset to embrace the emergent, to embrace the realities of change itself. And that's a different mindset. We have to continue to get away from this notion that, in a matter of weeks or months, it'll be fine. No, let's step back. Now, having said that, one of the most effective ways of actually embracing this is to have a very frank conversations with yourself around how are you then going to manage your energy? How are you going to set boundaries that make sense for you in your life to be able to then merge and ensure that how you're spending your time matches what you consider to be most important? How do you find that energy and ways to renew the energy? And so even that interest, the example you just shared about the meeting around time, around the client was saying time, I would challenge that thinking a little. And instead of time, I would replace it with energy. Because during turbulence, during uncertainty, during periods of change, which we all are and will be in, how we decide to renew and how to shake up and and adjust our energy is going to be key. And whether that's taking a break every hour and just breathing steady for a minute, or every hour or two walking around to be able to take a quick break, there's so many small things that we as humans need to do to find renewal activities so that we can show up as our best self, not continuously, but impulsing that correlates with our own humanity.
Yeah, and Peter, I know, as a psychologist, you're also very familiar with mindset and mindfulness, right? How does that play into helping leaders have the right mindset, and as Daniel said, being mindful of the things that they need, as well as balancing that with the needs of the organization? How do you help leaders do that?
I think a great way to do it is actually to think of a cheetah. We learn a lot as we watch a cheetah run. Fastest land animal. They can hit 60 miles an hour. But as researchers have clocked and watched cheetahs, they really only go about 30, 40 miles an hour when they're hunting. They don't need to sprint all the time. And what really sets them apart is their ability to pivot. There's that cheetah pause. They are able to then jump from one side to the next. It's that agility. As leaders, we can get really focused on the need to go fast all the time. That's not what makes the cheetah successful. The cheetah is able to pause and pivot and move, and they regulate their energy so that they can accomplish their goal. So as we're thinking from a psychological perspective, from mindfulness, from that mindset, are we confusing activity with results? Are we recognizing that we may not be able to continue going at that pace? What are those re-energizing activities that we can engage in? Are we operating in an environment where we can talk about our energy? We can talk about emotions. We feel psychologically safe to say, you know what? This is a rough day. Yeah, talking about the cheetah and just taking that time to pause, to have that self-reflection, not just thinking about what is it that I can accomplish and what are my superpowers in doing that, but recognizing what do I need in order to be able to sustain that.
Yeah.
And we all have needs, and we can't ignore those.
So this has been such a great conversation, and I could just go on and on with this because it's such interesting stuff, but I want to be respectful of time. So how do we get a hold of you? How do people contact you if they want to continue the conversation or get a hold of your services? What's a good way for both of you?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Our website, stewartleadership.com, is the best way of learning about us as a company. Our bios are there. Please reach out at any point. We'd love to have a conversation. To learn more about us and learn more about how we can add value for others.
And just as one additional way you can learn more about us, we've also launched a podcast, Leadership Growth Podcast. We launched that in January. You're welcome to find that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast fix. And that's been fun as we've joined the podcast world to be able to share thoughts, ideas, stories, and talk with great talent like yourself, Ernest.
Yeah, Leadership Growth Podcast, right?
Correct.
Right. Yeah, definitely check that out. I mean, that's a great podcast. Definitely make sure that you check that out. And then before I let you guys go, I always want to take advantage of the experts that I have on the show, like yourself, and ask, what's a tip or advice that you have for leaders and organizations, especially in this time that we're all in? Peter, why don't you go first?
One piece of advice is, I think, be patient with yourself. Be patient with yourself, as you are trying to grow one little step at a time. Yeah. And we set ourselves up for tremendous frustration when we set unrealistic expectations. Not to say we shouldn't set expectations that aren't high, but help them be realistic and then make plans to achieve those and provide that structure, support, and encouragement for others so that they can hit those high standards as well.
Yeah. I love that. Be patient with yourself. I think we're often told be patient with others, but be patient with yourself is something that's not always commonly told. So I love that. Daniel, what about you?
Yeah, I would suggest that every conversation we have a choice. And we have a choice to choose between judging and critiquing, or to be curious and to learn. And it is to be conscious of that choice so that we do not overplay one or the other and mix and match in unhelpful ways. And oftentimes we have a default of critiquing and judging. And I would challenge all of us to try to build that muscle to be able to be more curious and to challenge ourselves as we're engaging in conversation, in meetings, about to send the email or the Teams message or the Slack message. Am I showing a good level of curiosity so that I can appreciate and learn as well?
Yeah, I love that advice. I was just talking to someone about active listening and how that really requires you to listen to understand and not to judge or to debate or to argue or to wait for your turn. It's really about just making sure you're understanding. So I love that curiosity, that making sure that you're understanding, you're listening instead of just being judgmental. So that's such great advice. Guys, it's been such a pleasure to have you both on the show. This has been such a great experience. I'm so glad that you two were able to break the mold of having two guests on. I think I'm definitely going to have to do this again because it's been such a great experience. So hopefully we'll have you guys come back on and talk about more of the great things that you do, because you guys do such great work. And so I appreciate the work that you guys are doing, out there and helping leaders be successful and help them to develop. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Ernest. Our pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Ernest.
Awesome. And to our guests, thanks for listening. We hope you will join us again next time.